Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the first roundtable. My name is Dominick, and I'll be moderating this session, the past 80 years in Canadian comics. Before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping notes. As I mentioned before I started recording, today's roundtable is being recorded to be available for post-viewing. So just be aware that if you would prefer not to have your voice or your image recorded, to leave your camera off and not to speak. I'm going to enable the live transcript now so that it should be running, and therefore anyone who needs live transcript should be able to see it for the session. I believe that you have the option, if you find it distracting, to click on it and select the hide subtitle option so that you can eliminate that from your screen if you wish. If you have any questions for the presenters, especially during the earlier part of the session when they're going over their presentations, if you can post them into the chat, they will be gathered together, and then I can bring them in after we open the session up to questions. And of course, we will also be open to questions after the presenters have talked as well. Yeah, so there'll be lots of ways for you to ask questions. And if you prefer to ask your question yourself, when your question comes up, I could give you the opportunity of speaking directly rather than just reading the question. The chat will be recorded along with the presentation. We will also be, as I believe Candida mentioned earlier, gathering up any links or interesting information that people post about resources in the chat and making that available to presenters after the conference is over as well. So what we're going to do for this session, since it was a pre-recorded session, all the panelists short videos for you to watch, is have each of them just do a sort of a brief recap or précis, I guess, of their key points to refresh your memory, or if you have not had a chance to watch the videos to give you an idea of what they're talking about. I would urge you to go and watch the videos, though, to get the full story. And then after each of the presenters has spoken briefly to their topic, we will engage in a dialogue. I'll bring some questions to them that we've already considered as possible topics of discussion. And then after that discussion, probably when there's about half an hour left, we will open up for more general questions. So we're just going to go through the presenters in the order that they appeared in the program. So I will introduce each presenter briefly. The presenter will give a brief talk and then move on to the next presenter. This should take us probably 15-20 minutes to get through that section. So first, we have Andrew O'Malley, who's a professor in the English department of the university formerly known as Ryerson, where he teaches courses in comics, children's literature and culture, and the 18th century. He's the author of The Making of the Modern Child, Children's Literature and Childhood in the Late 18th Century, and of Children's Literature, Popular Culture, and Robinson Crusoe, as well as being the editor of Literary Cultures and 18th Century Childhoods. For a number of years, he's been working on an online exhibition and digital archive on the mid-20th century anti-comics campaign. You can find a link to this on the bio page for the presenters, which I believe, yes, Candida just posted a link to that in chat, so you can go and check that out right now if you want to. And the topic of his talk for this panel was WECA comics and their young readers. Andrew.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Dominic. Thank you. I also just want to start off by saying thanks to all the organizers for this terrific event. I'm really very grateful to have been included. Should I share screen or should I just zip through my main points? Is it worth showing the slides again? Maybe I'll try and share if I can.
Yeah, I think it's always nice with comics to be able to see what we're talking about.
I agree. So, okay, great. So in my recorded presentation, I talked about the WECA in my title. This is an acronym for the War Exchange Conservation Act, which was legislation introduced by the Canadian government in 1940 to conserve currency for importing war materials. The legislation prevented the luxury items, including American comics, from crossing the border. This vacuum that was left behind from the absence of American comics created an opportunity for a homegrown comics industry that lasted, I guess, about 5 years, because after the After the war, American comics were allowed back on the market, and the Canadian publishers were no longer able to compete. I also spoke briefly about X University's, or formerly Ryerson University's, WECA collection. There's 120 books, all from the Bell Features publisher, formerly known as Commercial Science of Canada. It includes titles like Active Comics, Dime Comics, Funny Comics, and Triumph Comics, of course, most famous for Nelvana. Comics constituted a really rare example of a largely child or youth-driven popular culture phenomenon that had a lot less gatekeeping than other media for children. So if we, for example, the conventional children's book industry, virtually every facet of it is done by or performed by adults. So writing, editing, marketing, library selection, reviewing, prize awarding, even the purchase of individual books for young readers tends to be done by adults. With comics, however, children typically bought their own, often with their own money. They chose the titles they liked best. Young people developed sometimes clandestine circulation or pass-along networks. And even content producers were often teenagers. An underlying assumption of children's media has long been that child readers only connect with narratives that feature child figures with whom they can readily identify. And so as a result, most children's books feature child or childlike protagonists. Comics, however, mainly featured characters who are adults in sort of adult situations. So part of their attraction for young readers may well have been that they exposed and invited children into an adult world of experience from which children are typically excluded. Bell Features and other publishers recognized, of course, the more direct relationship young readers had with their product than with more traditional children's books. And they encouraged reader participation through clubs and contests and games and so on. Now, these acted, of course, as useful advertising tools or promotional tools for publishers, but also they've also fostered communities and networks of young readers across the country. So finally, I left off my presentation with what I hoped was a poignant example of the second prize winner of a cover drawing contest shown here, who submitted his entry from his residence at the Home for Incurable Children, 278 Bloor Street East in Toronto, and speculated that the comics reading community, or the kinds of community that comics afforded children, may well have offered him some comfort during his difficult times. And that was it.
Thank you, Andrew. The second presentation is Amie Wright, who's a PhD candidate in history at Carleton University, studying comics, moral panics, and child education. For more than 10 years, Amie worked as a librarian, including 5 years as the manager of school outreach at the New York Public Library, and over 3 years with the American Library Association Graphic Novels and Comics Roundtable, including serving as its first inaugural president. Recently, she delivered a workshop for the Teaching History Conference on teaching history with comics. At part-time, Amie moonlights as an instructor in McGill's Graduate School of Information Studies. You can follow her at Library Landia for sporadic tweeting. Again, that is in the bio on the contributors page. And her topic today, which I confess I found absolutely fascinating, Alberta's Forgotten Censor and the Continued Campaign Against Comics Post-1954.
Hi, everyone. Dominic, is it okay for me to share my screen? I just have a few slides that I'd like to show.
Yes, no problem. You should have an icon at the bottom of the screen that allows you to do so.
Alrighty. Yep, we're good to go. Okay. So I should say, hi, everyone. It's super exciting to be here. It's great that we're actually talking about Canadian comics. So I am a former librarian, current history PhD student, and like so many of us, I think sometimes research works backwards. I worked as a librarian and also with schools and libraries for more than 20 years. And one of the things that pervasively I kept hearing was comics, let's call it reticence. It wasn't always explicit pushback or explicit censorship, but it seemed to not be populating our collections that actually reflected the popularity, or there was a lot of scrutiny around particular titles. And even the former position I had with the American Library Association is in itself unusual if you consider the fact that Randall Scott, so longtime academic librarian at the University of Michigan, 1990, Randall Scott publishes a book called Comics Librarianship, a Handbook. And he very optimistically says, in 10 years, we'll have comics librarianship in all aspects of our profession. So I was the first president of the Graphic Novel and Comics Roundtable, and that roundtable was only officially institutionalized in the American Library Association in 2018. So professionally, there seems to be a lag. A lot of people have talked about the lingering moral stigma, and that's also what I attribute it to. But my research started to show me that there was far more going on in terms of Canadian and also US and international history, specifically around community organizations post-1954 than we've previously talked about. So, and just want to confirm, maybe with a thumbs up, everyone can see my slides now? Correct? Fantastic. So one of the things I want to draw your attention to is 1954 Senate hearings. We talk an awful lot about the fact that obviously Fulton Wortham presented very bombastically with the 1954 Senate hearings too. It's important to note they were televised live. So even though we had Senate hearings in Canada in 1952, 1953, they were not televised live. So I think this is an important thing to talk about when we talk about the general fear and discussion around child health in that point in time. And also an important point for my research is to recontextualize living through and still as we are a pandemic. So in the late 1940s and early 1950s, of course, we have the polio crisis. In late 1940s, there was actually stay-at-home orders ordered throughout major cities in North America for kids every August, because that was polio season. And 1953, 1954 were the largest rates of polio for kids. And there was question whether or not even a vaccine would pop up. So when we have the Senate hearings in 1954, it's a huge climate of fear around child health. One of the things I think we don't talk about enough is that Fulton was himself a special invited guest to the US Senate hearings. And very specifically, he talks about the fact that current Canadian legislation, in his opinion, is not enough. So of course, we have comics added to the crime code under Fulton's private member bill in 1948, but Fulton's like, nope, it's not enough. He says, we need a campaign. And he talks about the fact that the Home and School Federation is about to mount a campaign against what he deems an emergency of crime comics. So my research focuses on the completely under-researched Alberta Board on Objectionable Publications. So they were founded in Alberta in December 1954. So this is after the Senate hearings. They come from representatives from various involved community organizations who saw an urgent need to take up this charge. They started to become active through early 1955. They were soliciting public opinion. We have the Calgary Herald here from March 9th, 1955. And you can see the title is Public Aid is Urged in Comic Book Battle. So one important thing to note, especially for me vocationally, is who the Alberta board was made up of. So very specifically, members of the Alberta board were drawn up by members of the profession. So we have prominent members from librarianship, including here, red circle, you may be familiar, especially I know we have a lot of people from Alberta on the line. This is Bruce Peel, so former chief librarian at the University of Alberta for about 30 years, former Canadian Library Association president, and for historical context, the founder of Peel's Prairie Provinces, which are some of the foundational texts in Western Canadian history. So Bruce Peel, there he is, 1960, serving on the Alberta Board of Objectionable Publications. For the purpose of my presentation, I talked a little bit more about the overview of the board, but I just want to very quickly talk about their publication of What's Wrong with Comic Books, which was published in 1956. And they published more than 40,000 copies of this in color that they sent all across North America to faculties of education, faculties of librarianship, US counterparts, including the National Organization for Decent Literature, the Cincinnati Evaluation for Comics, which I mistakenly talk about as the Cleveland Committee in my recorded presentation, apologies. and other organizations throughout. Chicago, for example, had a very notable anti-comics committee that actually partnered with the Chicago Public Library. So one of the things we see both in this pamphlet and in all of these campaigns in the late 1950s and early 1960s is we see the comics battle morph into initiatives to promote, quote, good reading. You can see number 6, this idea of all comics are detrimental to good reading skills. And one of the biggest things that my research talks about that I'm continuing through the PhD, looking at similar, whether they're formal or informal boards across Canada, is how this has, I would argue, continued in present day. We often see comics popping up on reluctant reader shelves, or idea of comics being less than. And obviously, as we all know, they continue to be amongst the most banned and challenged. Here locally in Canada, Raina Telgemeier's drama was pulled from the Ottawa Catholic School Board in 2019. And of course, I think none of us have missed the fact that Jerry Craft's New Kid, which was the first graphic novel to win the Newbery in 2020, is now being currently pulled from Texas school shelves because of the perception that it teaches critical race theory. So I would argue this lingering moral stigma is not just a moral stigma, it's a vocational stigma that had been institutionalized for longer than we've talked about. And my research really talks about the need for us vocationally to interrogate our own professional histories. Thank you.
Thank you, Amie. Next up is Julie Rack, who is Henry Marshall Torrey Chair in the Department of English and Film Studies at the University of Alberta. Her latest book is False Summit, Gender and Mountaineering Nonfiction. She has written extensively on nonfiction, including the books Boom, Manufacturing Memoir for the Popular Market, and Negotiated Memory, Doukhobor Autobiographical Discourse. Her latest edited collection is the Identities volume of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Literary Theory. With Sonia Boone, Candida Rifkind, and Laurie McNeil, and other clever colleagues, she is writing the Routledge Introduction to Autobiography in Canada, which I personally cannot wait to see. And the topic of her talk was Nelvana in the Classroom, Challenges.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. Can you hear me all right? Great. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Also, great. I'm going to do 3 challenges in 3 minutes. And thanks, Dominick, for that generous introduction. I have to say the comics part of our autobiographical textbook is going to be really good because Canada's in charge of that. So we know it's going to be great. Okay, so I just want to say a couple of things. I've been teaching graduate and undergraduates about comics and specifically about autobiographical and Canadian comics for about 5 years. I've mostly published on autobiographical comics, although I presented and thought about Nelvana for some time. Just so that you know, I am also the co-editor of the reissue of this book, Life Among the Halunat by Minnie Outlaw Freeman, who is an Inuk author. And that book, I worked with Minnie extensively to do that. So some of what I know about, if I know anything about Inuit, it's because of Minnie. So I want to acknowledge her as my teacher. I have put my treaty acknowledgements in the chat. Okay, so let's do this in 3 minutes. I am really interested in what John Bell was saying for a couple of reasons around this. One is that Bell said, listen, I don't want the study of comics to become just, professorial. I don't want it to be just academic. I always want non-university people involved, and totally get it. It should happen like that. But he also said teaching comics is super important in the university. So both of those things are true, and I think they express the tension I'm going to talk about. So we have some challenges when we're trying to teach about Nelvana and the Northern Lights, and I'm just going to move us down here so that it's easier to see my slides. So we know the history of Nelvana, and we just heard some excellent discussion about that and about the Canadian Whites. We know but the thing about it is, as great as John Bell's resources are, as important as they are, they have contributed to the creation of Nelvana as a romantic nationalist story, as part of our point of pride that we have the first female superhero in the world, and that is before Wonder Woman, and all this kind of stuff, and also that she's some kind of Inuk heroine. But the real story of this is more complicated, and so when we're teaching Nelvana, it's really important when we talk about Canadian comics history, to my mind, to be able to think about the alternate narratives, and especially around origins, because why are we celebrating this right? Like, you know, there's a long history of Inuit being used as the evidence of Canadian national difference without their permission or knowledge. And we can't do that here. So challenge 2 is related. It's about origins. Okay, so origins mean a lot of things. For one thing, there are several stories about how Nelvana came to be. And there's 2 stories that are related to Franz Johnston, a member of the Group of 7 and friend of Adrian Dingle, who was the person who designed and drew most of Nelvana. First of all, it's important to know that there's a story that seems to relate to Kukulakak, who was an Inuit elder living in Coppermine when Franz Johnson went up there. Now it's called Kugluktuk. And Franz Johnson went there to sketch and to draw images of the North and the people who lived there. He came back and told Adrian Dingle about this. And when he did it, he told 2 different stories about this. The first he said was that he had sketched a young woman and her children, and that this was an inspiration for Nelvana, a name that he had heard there as well, that the woman's name was Nelvana. So it was told like it was a Madonna and child story. And then the second one is this story, which was told by the son of Adrian Dingle, Christopher Dingle, to Hope Nicholson. And here it is here. But what my dad says, well, Nelvana, the real Nelvana, was an old hag, an old woman who was perhaps a shaman, a seer, a healer, or something, but a toothless old woman in some Inuit village. And I'm sure there was alcohol involved, I think, for the conversation that they were having. But they started talking about what a romantic name this was, etc. So that story is ignorant. It really has no understanding of who Inuit are, no understanding of what they were seeing. Like, this story is being told secondhand, right? But these are the origins that we have, and we should be able to do a little better than that. And Hope Nicholson did try. So she went to Coppermine because her dad had been a doctor there, and so a lot of people knew her and would talk to her. And there's several origins for who Nelvana might have been. One is on the left here. This is Connie Nelvana, who's actually got TB and is sitting in the Campbell Hospital in 1950. And she's posing for the newsletter for a picture. And the other is Cecile Nelvana on the right. Connie Nelvana did go home, by the way, from the hospital, but Cecile Nelvana actually ended up living on the land and becoming an artist. And so Ellie Adjan, who is related to Cecile Nelvana, says it's an Inuktitut name given at birth by elders of the community. It is passed down from a respected elder who has passed away or is in honor of them. My grandmother's name was Cecile Nelvana Kamingoak. We only call her Nelvana. So, and Ellie said, I don't think Cecile knew anything about the Nelvana comic at all. Like, I don't think she would have cared. So it's really important to be able to talk about those origins, figure them out, understand what the context is, particularly because I think there is a very real possibility here that Nelvana was culturally appropriated without the knowledge or participation of these people. And it's important, that's part of the story that we need to teach. Okay, challenge 3, tracing and style. I have a very fast story to tell about this, and then we're out. Okay, so one of the things that's challenging about teaching Nelvana is that we don't have the object. What we have is like this book, the fantastic reprint of the, that we have that even enables us to teach Nelvana at all. It also exists as a PDF, right? That was done by Hope Nicholson and Rachel Ritchie through a Kickstarter program. But the problem is we don't have everything. Our students often haven't had a chance to read comic books from that era. They may not have collected them. They don't know materially what they look like. And a little bit like what we just heard in the first presentation when Andrew was talking about how important it is to look for evidence of reader participation in those ads and those invitations to write in and share experiences or contests. None of that information that would have been in the Triumph books is in the reprints in Nelvana. So we don't know much about who read Nelvana from that. And so we're missing things. And so it can be a real challenge. And the next challenge is design. Nelvana is incredibly busy. As you can see here from this, just my little circle up at the top, it's incredibly detailed. Adrian Dingle was a visual artist. His style was unusual, especially in the early books. There's 50 million kinds of gutters, if there is one, right? There's circles, there's squares, there's, you name it. It's hard for students to read it. Later on, Dingle's style simplifies and looks more like a regular action comic like you'd see in the US. but that means he loses atmosphere. And so that is hard to teach. So my last thing is I had a grad student who was blind, and he had to do a tracing exercise, which is a haptic learning exercise that is from Carnegie Mellon University that I received through Canada Rifkind. And I know she's going to provide in the chat a little bit of a note about that. So you can go look at that exercise. And it's to get students who don't draw to be able to really understand how comics design works through tracing. This particular blind student wanted to do it. So he made a 3D printed model of a page of Nelvana, but it took him 4 months because it was so hard to reproduce. So this is what's really, I mean, even in that situation, this is the challenge of teaching this comic. How do we really get students to read it? It's not that we shouldn't do it, it's that we should be aware of these things as we think through what it means to talk about the Canadian whites today to people who have never seen them. Okay, so that's all I'm gonna do. I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie. Next up, we have Fiona Smith, who's a Toronto feminist painter, illustrator, cartoonist, and comics educator who collaborated with sex educator Corey Silverberg on the award-winning children's books, What Makes a Baby, Sex is a Funny Word, and the forthcoming, Sex. Somnambulance, a 30-year collection of her comics, was published by Kiama Press in 2018, and I highly recommend that you get it if you don't already have it. Fiona was inducted into the Doug Wright Awards Giants of the North Canadian Cartoonist Hall of Fame in 2019. And the topic of her talk was Sad Clowns to Psychedoolia, Stripping Through the Late 20th Century. Fiona.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here and to be included in this conversation. So I'm an active cartoonist, I guess, and an educator. I teach at OCAD. A cartooning course called Graphic Novel Illustration, which is a terrible name for a comics class. It's because it's not illustration, it's cartooning. And so my presentation is, and can you see it? I'm sharing it, but I'm not sure. Yeah? Great.
Yes, we can see it.
So I'm sharing my own personal experience of coming up during the late 80s and into the 90s, and even talking about what happens a little bit later, but pinpointing Chester Brown's Yummy Fur zine, which wouldn't have been called a zine at the time, it would have been called a mini comic, and how that was like mind opener for me and for many other young cartoonists who were emerging at the time, and of course he was young too. So then I draw a line to Mark Bell's Psychedoolia. So the continuation from one to the other is the presence of zines and self-publishing and having that freedom to get your work out to the world without any kind of editorial censorship and also financially, it's very easy to print a scrappy black and white zine. I'm not sure if I can show more than one slide. Yeah, so sorry, I can't share any more of my slides. I'm not going to be able to figure it out in the moment, but yeah, so I talk about a bunch of the players of that time and some folks that you're all very familiar with, like Seth and Chester and Joe Matt and Julie Doucet. And then I talk about some folks that you might be less familiar with, like you might know Mark Bell's work, but you might not be as familiar with Amie Lockhart's work. Yeah, there's, because of the constraint of the time, there was some stuff that I withdrew. So like in regards to Chris's talking about the multiple solitudes of Canadian comics, I did mention Billy Mowbray's Monostoraki in Montreal, and then a few cartoonists, including Henriette Valium, who unfortunately we lost in the last year. And so, of course, there was Montreal, Toronto crossover happening, especially in the zine kind of milieu. So I guess that's it from me, and thanks for having a look.
Thank you, Fiona. And finally, for this roundtable, we have Chris Reyns-Chikuma, He's a professor at the University of Alberta. He teaches courses on Francophone cultures, especially bande dessinée in French, and courses on comics and comparative literature in English. He's published on various topics during his career. 5 years ago, he co-edited the first special issue on Canadian comics in CRCL, or CLC, again, a valuable resource for scholars of Canadian comics. 2 years ago, he formed a research group to work on the Canadian world of comics. Together, they started preparing for the first conference on Canadian comics that was supposed to take place in Montreal in May 2021, but for perhaps obvious reasons was postponed until May 2022. He recently published several articles on the connections between the various solitudes, Francophone, Anglophone, and Manga, and the world of Canadian comics. And his topic is linked to that project, what is beyond the two solitudes in the Canadian world of comics BD project. Chris. Are you there, Chris? I saw you a minute ago. Ah, there you are.
I think Chris may be muted.
Chris, you need to unmute yourself.
Here, sorry about that. I couldn't find my mute. So thank you very much for the organizers, for inviting me to the organizers. And yes, I'm going to share right away. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, wonderful. So the project, as you said in the introduction, thank you very much, Beyond the Two Solitudes in the Canadian World of Comics, in French, because it's a bilingual project, or multilingual project. It's called Au-delà des deux solitudes dans le monde canadien des BD. And here it is, of course, you probably all know, since you all, if not Canadians, at least specialists of something Canadian, literature or comics, the concept of two solitudes. And of course, the title is insisting very much on beyond, because we don't want to stick with that old-fashioned concept. Although what I should say is that in the world of comics, either in the production or in the distribution or in the academic world, is still very, very separated. Actually, the two solitudes is real, even in this academic, even in this symposium, where I mean, the communication between the two is not that great, and that this type of a symposium that is going to be able to let us go beyond these two solitudes. So there's an absence of communication between the two worlds. There are exceptions, obviously, but there are exceptions. So what I'm trying to do with my collaborators is to go beyond these exceptions also. It includes, for example, what we could call a fourth solitude, which is the manga world I mean, which is very powerful and much about it. And there is a whole world of Canadian manga, either in within the community of the fans, for example, in Canada, and that's often not included in the Canadian world of comics when we talk about it. So yeah, the separation between these different solitudes. And then, so we started that project in about 2015, informal discussions first, and then there was the publication, Dominick said, of one of the first publications on the topic. And we stopped for a while for different reasons, and then we restarted in 2018. And we started to plan other events, and now we have quite a lot of events, actually, publications, an exhibition in the Museum of Alberta in Edmonton that was supposed to take place also in past June, some months ago, but because of COVID was on 10 Canadian artists, comics artists, and we have several publications, as it is written here in my main presentation. This is a website that we created also a bit more than 1 year ago. As you can see, also is bilingual. This is a main point. What we want to do, our goal is to try to bridge the two solitudes, or the 3 or 4 solitudes, meaning that we try to see what are the interconnections, because what we were surprised, I mean, is the fact that the Canadian tradition, when we talk about Canadian tradition of comics, we often, as it is often the case here in this symposium, is the Anglo-Saxon one. The fact of starting with 80 years ago, I mean, with the comics, the whites, is symptomatic of that. I mean, obviously there were plenty of comics that were not part of the whites. For example, in Quebec, and that's not part of the symposium, for example, unfortunately, but that is the point of the symposium, to open the discussion and to go maybe beyond that, and to try to go to see that there are plenty of comics in Canada that, as we said several times, but among these plenty, we have also the French ones. And it's a very rich world that is also problematic as much as the superheroes, the Canadian superheroes are. For example, Nelvana, I mean, was an example of how problematic it is, but it's also the case of the French ones that were very Catholic, for national Catholic comics, so also problematic for some other reasons. But it would be also interesting to include them, and especially to include the connections between both. I mean, what are the bridges between both communities, or 3 or 4 communities? Are they the fans? In the case of manga, it's very much the fans who are the bridges, the passeur between these two worlds, but often also the publishers, sometimes the artists, etc., etc. So I'm going to end it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to all of you for revisiting your topics for us. I'm going to move now into a few questions that are for the panelists, and my hope is that the questions will be sufficiently broad that each of you might have something to say about them. But if you don't feel you have anything that you want to say about a particular topic, don't feel obligated. After having watched your presentations, a few things occurred to me as largely common interests or concerns across them. Several of you, for instance, addressed questions of gatekeeping in one way or another, whether via economics, such as the WECA Act, or government intervention, or I guess you might say grassroots or populist intervention as well. Would any of you care to expand on how you see external controlling factors and their motivators? For instance, the idea that comics are for kids and therefore should only address certain topics, or other concerns as having shaped Canadian comics. Anyone want to speak to that?
I can start. I think there's so much to say, and I should say I'm really glad we have the GLAM panel coming up later today, and I'd urge everybody to attend that. For, I think, anybody on the line who works in libraries and archives in schools, as we know, gatekeeping is one of the most pervasive and least discussed and least researched form of censorship that exists. And we're very reticent to call it what it is, which is censorship. It was really interesting for me, having worked as a librarian, to see it in practice, where people would say, we can't purchase this because, and they would X number of factors. There's not a review in a particular journal. And we overlook the historical context that a lot of those standards for collections developed at a time in which librarians in schools were using national reading lists, national reading competitions to define a particular idea of the nation state. These parameters we developed were very explicit in their gatekeeping parameters for developing a certain type of reading culture, a certain type of national citizen. It didn't mention, but one of the quote on what's wrong with comic books under point number 6 is a quote from the Senate of Canada hearings. I mentioned it in my recorded presentation, which specifically talks about the idea of a nation of digest readers, which they perceived comic book readership would create, is not a nation that will actually progress. And I think we see that implicit in a lot of things. And for me, the other thing I'll just add is, even at the time that I was researching, there's all these articles in the Calgary Herald in which people in Alberta are pissed about this board. And they're like, this is a censor. Like, why are they telling me and my kids what to read? And the board is like, we're not a censor. We're just an advisory board. So I think also the language we use around gatekeeping is so important. Like when we talk about professional standards or bureaucracy. And there's so much great work being done in critical librarianship to really unpack how this bureaucracy functions as really a mechanism of white supremacy and keeping the status quo. And I think this is something that perpetuates in so many aspects even today. So yeah, I think gatekeeping is something we need to continue to talk about and interrogate, both historically and in current professional practice.
Andrew or Julie or Fiona or Chris, do you want to speak to that?
Yes, I mean, I would agree with all the issues. It's a big issue, and there are many types of gatekeepers, as we said. I would like to emphasize, I would be the one emphasizing maybe the linguistic one or the cultural one. I mean, one more time to come back to the same issue, right? The one that I would here defend, or which is that obviously we need to go beyond the gatekeepers, the linguistic gatekeepers or the cultural gatekeepers, meaning that in the case of French and English, but there are others, obviously, I mean, indigenous included, and as I said, manga, for example. But there is, I think, a big issue where John Bell, for example, wrote an amazing history, obviously, of Anglo-Saxon, I mean, Anglo-Canadian comics, but somebody else had to write the history of the French ones, and there's nobody who's trying to write about what are the connections between both, and there are plenty. There are plenty of creators and now publishers trying to bridge the two communities or the three communities, for example. So that's what I would like to say here about that, gatekeepers.
Fiona, Julie, Andrew, any comments?
Sure. I was just going to say that, you know, indie publishers like Conundrum Press and Koyama Press, and for sure, John and Coralie have made attempts to kind of break that gatekeeping, and then we can see that happening in more mainstream publishers like Annick Press, who in the last couple of years have really tried to embrace emerging cartoonists who don't look like the white boys club, right? That and the stories that they have to share are different than what has preceded before. So there's definite motion in the right direction, but it's still a long way to go.
Andrew, Julie, anything to add?
Sure, I'll just add that, you know, children's culture is probably the most gate-kept of all cultures. So hence my interest in thinking about this material as not just a culture that was given to children for their consumption, but one that they actively kind of shaped themselves. And that shaping, I think, can usefully be understood as negotiating and getting around some of the kind of gatekeeping activity that children are constantly subjected to. So that's, you know, kind of thoughts on gatekeeping. Also, I guess, within comic studies, until fairly recently, childhood and child readers of comics were kind of the gate kept out of comic studies as a discipline. Charles Hadfield did a lot to kind of has done quite a bit to help that situation improve. But you know, that sort of separation of childhood as and anything that relates to childhood as less than serious, I think, was plagued comic studies for a while. So another kind of interest for me, anyhow, is to kind of reintroduce the reader, the child, as a consumer, and not just a consumer, but an active participant in the industry and its storytelling. So.
Julie, anything to add?
Not really. I think these comments are all great, and let's go on to something, because these are great. I have nothing to add.
Okay, great. I did one of the things that I found interesting in the presentations is, I guess, linked questions of, on the one hand, the consistency with which we dealt with gatekeeping, but I'm wondering about how how matters of gatekeeping may have changed over time and how they may still be similar. For instance, interestingly, Amie, in your presentation, one of the grounds you cite from the 1950s for why comics are bad is they're racist. And Julie, that's something you're still talking about as one of the problems that we have to confront if we're going to be teaching something like Nelvana. And I guess my flip side of that is, how have Canadian comics resisted this sort of gatekeeping? And perhaps the most obvious way is through the production of the kind of comics that Fiona especially was talking about, independently published or self-published small zines. But what's your take on the changing landscape for how we try to gatekeep comics, and how comics and comics creators try to speak back against that? Anyone have any thoughts? Or is that just a bad question?
Go, Fiona, go.
I was just going to say, I mean, it's happening in, the small press browsery at TCAF, the Toronto Comics Art Fest. It's like all the independent, the folks who are self-publishing and with abandon. It's just like it's an explosion, and so much so that TCAF created the Zineland Terrace, this extension. I mean, I'm talking pre-pandemic, of course, but it was part of their digital online version. But yeah, there's just there's no gatekeeping, except there might be a financial issue of trying to get a table at TCAF. The Zineland Terrace was a more affordable option than being in the main part of TCAF. And there's Expo Zine in Montreal, there's FanCaf in Vancouver, there's CanZine, which has a big comics presence. Yeah, it's just a never ending. And of course, online presence, in specifically in Instagram is really great breeding ground for emerging cartoonists.
I think we have to make a distinction between gatekeeping and access, and also things like hate speech. So to me, I think, and I don't think we've worked any of that out. I think this is a really interesting time. And I'm really happy for this symposium, because I think this is a chance to think that through a little bit. Like, does it mean, and also even just plethora, like the problem with ephemera is there's so much of it, but the promise of ephemera is it tells a different story. And so what are we going to do with super racist comics? Because they're all over the place. And, like Nelvana is like that. And, what are we going to do with that? And to me, I never think you're going to get rid of those things, but it's more like we need to figure out ways of doing that in ways that are going to open up conversations and make the historical record meaningful without a re-engaging hate as part of history without reflecting on it, or and I know that we're going to see the two-spirit, gay, lesbian, bisexual, to everything else, kind of discussion coming up, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. In other words, what does gatekeeping, what did it do? Is censorship productive, which is what Judith Butler says it is? What, does censorship do things? And if it did, do we want those things? And to me, that's the discussion we need to have too, not just, is there a flow of information or not? So that's the conversation I'm looking forward to.
Does anyone else want to speak to that topic?
Amie?
Go ahead, Amie.
Yeah. I think also it's really important to, when we're doing any historical research, is to think of the idea of agency, and that all historical actors are as we are. So one of the interesting things, Dominick, you brought up a point number 3 in the What's Wrong with Comic Books, is this idea of comic books being potentially racist. I think a lot of this builds on obviously Wortham's research, and this is something we've all wrestled with, the fact that Wortham hated comic books and yet also testified in Brown versus the Board of Education in the US, and was very much an advocate for desegregation of schools. So I would say because this in Alberta, remember, 1950s, I mean, Alberta had the first eugenics program in the British Commonwealth, not to mention, you know, hugely productive residential school system. And in Canada at the time, you know, there's a lot of historical research about Canada having more sort of polite racism policies than in the US, where it's explicitly stated in terms of laws. Like Viola Desmond, of course, is arrested, you know, Nova Scotia in the late 1940s. So I don't think, including point number 3, I would say it's more performative allyship in the 1950s. Like they were leveraging debates that were productive for them. And one of the things I found with the board's records in terms of their private correspondence is even in the late 1950s, they know that the number of comic books on newsstand is practically diminished to almost nothing in Alberta. And yet publicly, they're talking about, we need to keep this thread up. I mean, they released a pamphlet in 1962 saying the choice is yours, parents, like you need to take action. But I mean, privately behind the scenes, they know that the newsstands don't have comics targeted towards kids, but they use this kind of performative presence to ban Playboy in Alberta in 1962. So I do think anytime we're doing this historical research, we have to understand that these are historical actors at play. Like we have people like the Women's Institute in Alberta picks up this cause, but the Women's Institute, they also were big proponents of eugenics. So, I mean, it's complicated and messy. And I think this is always the hardest thing, to hold all of these competing ideas, you know, in our head and in our scholarship and professional practice.
Just to add to that, Amie, I know also that the boards that say they weren't censorship also work for film and television and were in operation until the 90s. And so this isn't like something that's like over a long time ago either in Alberta. Like Alberta was created through this.
Oh,
so I think it's really important that what you're saying.
Oh, and I should say too, we talk about 1987, Darren Ott is arrested in Calgary. And, you know, we have comics in the Canadian Criminal Code in 2018. And this is with the obscenity clause, the idea of community standard is so arbitrary. So the legal history is also super muddy.
Could I add something here?
Please do, yes.
Hi, I'm Mark Shaneblum. I'm sorry, I came in late. So I didn't get all of the background on this discussion, but I'm a comic book writer, among other things, and I'm currently writing stories with some of these older characters and dealing directly with the racism of the period. And you just can't, pardon the expression, whitewash it. It's there, and it's overwhelming, and you really need to. And in dealing with this, what I've decided is some of these characters, the characters I'm dealing with, aren't necessarily going to be precisely as they were in the golden age. I'm not going to, you know, there's simply no way to square that circle. So I'm going to pretend that some of the more overt racism wasn't there, and sort of, I hate to say this, use this term, but to clean it up and to make these characters more relevant. But of course, you can't do that with the original source material. The source material is what it is, and you can't change it retroactively. I hope that makes sense.
Dominic?
Yes, Chris, go ahead.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that I completely agree with all, what was said. I mean, the past is pre-grim, not very good. But actually, when I teach that, my 2 courses, one in French, one in English, on comics, either about children, comics for children, or issues about racism, the students are extremely receptive and extremely creative to go above, to go beyond these 2 gatekeepers issues, where they don't find that comics are for kids. And if you have some very quickly convinced that they were wrong, that it's not really serious to say that. And the same for racism, they're very creative and critical of these just by themselves, but then the discussion during the class amplifies that. So I'm very pessimistic about the past and very optimistic about the future, I would say.
Thank you, Chris.
Can I jump in briefly?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to say, Andrew, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. I mean, you know, it is a vexing and perennial question with dealing with this material. is the, how to teach it and how to, study it and also acknowledge its toxically racist content. I just wanted to point, I wish I had the link with me. Maybe I'll pass it along to Canada or somebody afterwards. But at my university, I have colleagues who have used the WECA comics in the collection. So Julie, we have the kind of the luxury of actually having the original object to look at. And some of these projects are, well, students do online publishing projects, and we have them all kind of housed together on a website, which is the link I would like eventually to share. And that was actually interestingly one of the top topics to which students doing these projects were drawn, is like what to do about, or how does racist representation in Canadian whites comics was really the kind of the dominant issue for our students who were introduced to this material. And they tried to deal with it by writing digital projects on it, or producing digital projects on it. So.
That's super interesting. I think that a lot of things, like if we're thinking, okay, history, you can't clean it up. I totally get what what you're saying. You have to make new things. What are you going to do with this? Right. But there's also, I think context is really important when you're teaching. And this is a really great time, for instance, to talk about the myth of the white Eskimo, which was a false history that circulated in children's books from the 1920s in Canada until at least the 50s and 60s. And, what is, Anna Herrera or whatever his name is, or, Nelvana's brother is that person, like, but as Flash Gordon. And so I think it's really important that's a really great opportunity to get to talk to students about that stuff. So I'd be really interested to see what your students decided to do with the representations, especially not just Nelvana, but like Brock Windsor, which is like, another really interesting example. So I'd love to hear more about that.
I'll find that link.
Thank you. I think everyone has.
Oh, thank you, Allison. That is it. That is the link. Allison, our special collections and archivist and librarian, has put the link in the chat. So thank you.
Thank you. I think everyone has spoken to that topic. Maybe I'll just ask one more question before I throw the floor open. And keeping in mind the overall theme of this conference, this symposium being, in effect, historical perspective, and given that the range of presentations today runs basically from the Canadian whites through to contemporary work, I'm wondering if the panelists have any thoughts about how assumptions about audiences for Canadian comics have changed over time, and how those assumptions may have changed the comics, or perhaps how those comics may have changed the assumptions. Do we still assume the same things about who comics are for, Canadian comics are for, and if so, why, and if not, why not?
Can I talk to that for a second?
Yes, go ahead.
As a creator, when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, or 70s and 80s, there was virtually nothing. I mean, there was Richard Cumley all by himself, and there were no Canadian comics to speak of. There were Canadians working in American comics, but I found there was nothing reflecting my time and place in my country and what my concerns. And there was that sense of being an outsider reading Justice League or Avengers or even the newspaper comic strips, and not being quite the target audience. And that's what that's what's so different now. There is a distinct Canadian voice. There is a distinct thing you can point at and say, this is Canadian comics, which literally did not exist before, say, 1965 or 70 or 75. It depends when you date it. So, I mean, it's the simple fact that there is such a thing and we're here in this conference is something of a miracle.
Thank you, Mark. Any of the panelists want to speak to that topic?
Dominick, can you rephrase your question? Can you just rephrase your question a bit? Because I want to think a little more about it.
Sure.
Thanks.
What I'm wondering is, thinking in terms of the historical perspective that we're we're focusing on in this presentation. To what extent in 2021 do we still have the same assumptions about comics readers that would have held in, say, 1940? Andrew, for instance, talking about how comics in the 1940s were basically seen as for children, for instance.
I would like to say something to that, but just as a provocation, I'm not sure we know that much about the readers. And I would, you know, like collectors know things because they could find stuff or they remember people reading. But the fact that the whites were so thoroughly forgotten that Mark, I'm from the 80s too, Mark, and you can tell like there was no recognition that these things had ever existed. So my question would be, what the heck were those readers? And does anybody even know anything about them other than our imaginations making things up about them? So that's my provocation. Thanks, Dominic.
Julie, I completely agree. That actually, that's a problem. That comparing both would be very difficult because in the past, for example, in the 40s, we don't know who was reading Nelvana. Was Nelvana, for example, more for girls or for women? We don't know that. And nowadays, we know it very well. We know around us. I mean, because we see plenty of readers, and we know it's much more mixed, much more diverse than it was. I mean, we assumed it much more than before, since we think that. When we think about Canadian comics, we think about, well, I mean, the whites, and the whites are mostly white males created by white males, therefore they would be read by white males, which is not necessarily exactly true. But so yeah, I mean, nowadays we know who they are. In the past, there are plenty of studies, if it's still possible to know.
Andrew, I think you might have some thoughts.
Yeah, I'll take up that provocation for sure. I haven't done the research. I haven't seen the research on the Canadian comics. I'm quite familiar with some of it on American comics, on readerships. There's evidence that the American counterparts at this time were largely being read by young people. There were surveys done that said that something like 93% of all young people were regular comics readers in the 40s and 50s in the United States. And that was actually pretty evenly split between boys and girls. The fact that the comics that these WECA comics, the Bell Features ones anyhow, address young people directly with their "Hey kids" kind of slogans and advertising suggests that they thought their readers were largely young people. So I think that there's enough. I don't know that I'll mention a colleague at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, Carol Tilley, who's done terrific work on comics readerships from the 50s. I don't know that she actually tracked down the people who wrote letters to the editors of horror comics, for example, in the 50s and the late 40s, and spoke to them about why they wrote those letters. Unfortunately, I don't know that that's possible with comics that were now 80 years old. If we're going to find anybody to do that, like if that research were undertaken now, I don't know that you'd find too many people who are still with us who could speak to their childhood reading of the comics. But I'm gonna propose that there's enough kind of anecdotal evidence, and there's enough evidence in our neighbors that's been kind of uncovered by scholars of the comics culture in their southern neighbors to suggest that, yeah, it probably was largely a young person's readership.
Andrew, I would agree with you partly, because when you say that they studied, for example, the people who wrote letters, that's one way to know. The problem is that we don't know if it's representative of the whole community of readers. I mean, the people who are writing are not necessarily representing the whole community or even a big part of the community. Some people are, I mean, for example, we can say that there was probably a gender bias also, like gatekeepers, to select the letters, for example. We don't know anything about that. I mean, they selected maybe white males, letters written by white males rather than by females, for example. So, and this is a big issue that is not dealt with.
Yeah, and I'm not proposing that they were exclusively read by young people either, but they certainly were read in huge volumes by young people. And I'm not going to try and speculate what percentage of the overall readership were young people, but probably pretty high. So
this is something that I think it would be interesting if we actually had multiple copies of multiple issues of these comics, because you can investigate, have the puzzles been filled out by the people who own them? What can we infer from those artifacts that the owners have added to the comics? Certainly, I know that it's not at all uncommon for kids to write on comics, maybe color in the black and whites. And this is where archives, I think, could be massively useful if we had not just like a representative copy, but multiple copies of these comics to look at. And connected to that, actually, we have a question that came in from the chat, a question from Irene, who's asking about online availability. And I think one way online availability is useful is making these old comics available. But Irene's question was somewhat different. With more and more comics online, available online, we see that social media algorithms also influence what people see. So instead of being a democratizing space, digital comics production is also subject to gatekeeping. How can we address this in online publications, do you think?
This is such an important question. And I actually think that one of the places to go is to read some of the really great work emerging on AI and algorithmic studies, not just in library science where there's some, and information science where there's good work, but also in cultural studies. And a lot of it by Americans, but not exclusively. And I think we need to know a lot more about how big data manages things generally, and then we can look through to figure out about how censorship works, what ideas of the child are, where protection is important, all that kind of stuff. And also, we've been talking very exclusively about superhero comics, and I want to really respect what Fiona was saying about underground comics. We need to understand that that's a different readership, and it's also a producer readership, and it may be different. The methods to trace and think about who is reading those and how do they circulate is going to be different. And I want to keep that in the conversation too.
Yeah, and I think it's well worth noting that these are topics that other presenters are getting into to some extent over the rest of the conference, but you're right to flag it. I think all of us can probably think of other instances. Art comics, for instance. B.P. Nickel was doing comics in the early 1970s. And we tend not to think about those sorts of things. Sorry to interject. Did any of the other panelists want to speak to this question about the online environment and how it might affect gatekeeping? Amie, go ahead.
I can talk a little bit. I think one of the things, and again, the GLAM panel later, I'd urge everybody to attend that. With the academic scholarship, there's a lot written about citation and relevancy rankings. And so we see a perpetuation in scholarship. So we know that there should be an expanding of conversations beyond John Bell's work, Bart Beatty's work, and Calgary. I mean, these are important foundational books in terms of creating the story, but they're not the whole story. But I think what happens, especially with so many of the algorithms, academic libraries, WorldCat, within our own scholarship, things get perpetuated. And of course, we look at citation indexing. So if something has been more cited, it's viewed more heavily. And even in academic scholarship, we're not preferencing, for example, podcasts. I would say the creators' voices themselves are often minimized. I mean, I know from the professional realm, the history teachers using comics or the librarians are also not the one contributing to scholarship because they don't have the professional ability to. So I think trying to figure out how we can better incorporate those voices, knowing that even our own research process is going to have a little bit of algorithmic and like professional bias implied.
Thank you. Does any other panelists want to speak to that question?
Just quickly, that actually a colleague of Julie in the English department wrote a beautiful book, a little book, but absolutely beautiful, about these issues of algorithm and how it is still going on. I mean, that's why it's not especially all optimistic, because algorithms are, as he shows in his book, it's Jonathan. Julie, can you help me? Jonathan?
Yes, it's Jonathan Cohn. I'm just going to put his name into the chat, and I'm going to put the title of his book. It's just a pretty recent book on algorithms and.
Sorry, I somehow managed to pause the recording for a minute there. I hope we didn't lose too much.
Okay.
Did anyone else wish to speak to that topic about online algorithms and gatekeeping? I do have a couple of questions for specific panelists, which, if you don't mind, I will ask. Although if the other panelists have thoughts on these questions as well, they should, I think, feel free to step in and add their comments. A question for Julie from Zach. If we recognize, as we should, Nelvana's position as an object of intolerance, as per Pilgrim, and propaganda that supports white supremacy, as per Wanzo, can you speak briefly about how or if you feel the work can be productively utilized within an anti-racist, anti-oppression approach to education?
This is an amazing question. I would say yes. I would say the most important thing to do is to provide as many of the contexts that you need to have in order to read it, in order to think through what it means. So for one thing, like, I find it really interesting that the early issues of Nelvana actually are about environmental threat. So, and that's something that actually is retained as something that really preoccupied Adrian Dingle. And I wish to say today's headline is about how there's gasoline in the water in Iqaluit. So, I mean, we really do, you know, like that idea that maybe Inuit knew about their environment, that there were environmental problems, and that knowing about animals was the way that they know about climate change. These things are actually corroborated in Inuit communities. And I think that there's an opportunity there to think that through in Nelvana. I also think that it's really important to think about, well, what are the assumptions about what women's bodies are supposed to look like in comics, and you know, and the fact that these were men making them, and so I think that stuff is really important to think through. So to me, yes, you should teach this. I think that comics like this, especially Adrian Dingle's comics, were complex. I think he had more than, I don't think he was you know, as a comic artist, he wasn't part of the Marvel sweatshop or the DC sweatshop. And so he didn't think like other people did about what he should be making. And I think in some ways that's a really good thing to think through, the good and the bad. So I actually think there's an opportunity there. I also think that there's a possibility that Franz Johnston actually drew the Inuit in the early issues of Nelvana, and that they're not racist pictures. Later on, you get a lot of racist portraiture, Japanese people in particular. But at the beginning, I actually think those are ethnographic sketches that have been adapted, but I'm not sure. And if there's anybody who knows that or wants to think about that, that offers up a possibility of things being about more than one thing. And isn't that what we're all teaching when we teach?
Thanks, Julie. Did any other panelists have any thoughts on that?
Well, I can just say that I know that my colleague Hope Nicholson did a lot of research on Nelvana and discovered there was an actual woman named Nelvana, and Dingle did go to the north, so he wasn't operating out of complete ignorance by any means.
Yeah, Julie talked about that in her presentation.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Did any other panelists wish to speak to this topic? Candida, I believe you said you had a question you'd like to ask.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask it because I can't bring it all together in words. And I'm trying to tweet this panel, but there's just so much going on that's so important that it's hard for me to keep track. But it seems to me what we're talking about a lot is methodology in comic studies and the problems of our methodology as researchers. So just thinking about the presentations, we have Fiona giving us an oral history and a memoir and naming names that have not entered the record. And that's so important. And then we have Andrew facing the problem of finding like testimonies or evidence of child readers. And in another context, back when I was a Canadian literature person, I read letters from kids to the authors of Mountie novels because I was looking at racist Mountie novels. But, you know, kids used to write to authors and publishers, but because they were named authors with a signature publishing at Macmillan or somewhere. So part of the problem too is, you know, the loss of the records of the publishing houses that might have kept letters from kids. And then Julie's talking about classroom experience as a methodology, but also an editor going up north and talking to living people and getting that oral history. So I think we might actually need another third project coming out of this conference, which is really thinking about methodologies in recovering Canadian comics history and practices, And I also want to mention that a lot of our colleagues working in other forms of Canadian pop culture, especially television studies, are facing the same problem because there's no national collection of Canadian television. They threw out the VHS tapes or the beta tapes before that. And so those researchers rely on eBay and collectors and people who randomly recorded things on tapes to, gather old Canadian shows. And I wonder how much we can actually connect with other fields studying so-called ephemeral Canadian pop culture and really think about our methodologies and what it means to not be able to do traditional academic research, and the pros and cons of that as well. So I just kind of want to throw that out to ask if any of the panelists have ideas about methodological challenges in Canadian comic studies beyond what you've already suggested.
Well, Candida, thanks for that. That's a terrific sort of synthesis of a whole bunch of really interesting stuff that I think this panel has been plumbing. But I don't know what I'm only starting on this research now, or fairly recently. I mean, I've been researching in the American context for years, but only in the Canadian one more recently. And I've noticed the one archive that I've accessed, the ex-university archive. None of the books, none of the comics published had letters to the editor section, right? So you don't actually have the words of readers appearing as part of the document. And I think that the kinds of letters that you're referring to, that young people did write to authors and comics creators. I'm not sure where, I wouldn't even know where to begin looking for it. So if anybody has any suggestions on, or even if it still exists, unfortunately, it was not integrated into the comics themselves as it often was in American comics of the period.
I guess just to interrupt, I think we're looking at serendipity, right, as one of our methods. Like you might find someone's diary or something in an attic, or Hope Nicholson goes up north and manages to find someone, or luckily Fiona was there and has an excellent memory and has visualized it all for us. But there's just such an element of chance and serendipity in telling Canadian comics history.
I'd say so. Another thing I think is that some of the methods that come from history and book history would help. So if you're thinking, okay, kids wrote authors, do those authors have archives? Is there, so you think, okay, so you go backwards from that, right? And I think Canada's right. If we're going to work as a community together, people just say, I've got this, I've got that. Like, I think that's the level on which we're at. Somebody in the chat said, what about diaries by kids? And actually there are a lot that are collected across the country, but we don't look for them to see what, do they talk about comics or do they draw what they had seen? And I actually think that we haven't done enough work on all of that. So I think that's true. We've got to go lateral and we've got to think like we're detectives and think about, well, how are we going to trace that?
Yeah, about methodology, I would say also that one way, something important is also to question the word Canadian, and some of the presenters are doing that. I mean, for example, Lauren York is going to have an amazing presentation questioning the issue of Canadian within the frame of Indigenous publications, for example. But it's the same for, I mean, the type of linguistic national way of thinking. One more time, many scholars, when they say Canadian, what they mean is Anglo-Canadian. When Quebec, and in Quebec does the same, when they talk about the bande dessinée, they mean the Quebec one. Although to some extent they're more frank, because at least they don't use the word Canadian. So it would be nice also to get out of that. Or at least to be critical of that frame of thinking Canadian, meaning one thing, one tradition, and there are several traditions, and it would be nice to try to include them all, and especially to see how they dialogue or they don't dialogue. So that would be my point about that.
I think most of the panelists have spoken to this. Fiona, did you have anything you wanted to add about this subject?
Sure. I was going to say that there are some books out there about psychedelia. There's Mark Bell's edited book, Nagadod, that collects some of the collaborative work that he did with some of the folks I mentioned in the slideshow, Jason McLean and Amy Lockhart and some other folks. And so there's samples of their mail art and their zines in that book. And that was through Conundrum Press. And also Conundrum Press published a collection of Sherry Boyle's zines and little bookworks called Witness My Shame. And then Mark Connery's Rudy comics, mini comics and zines were republished through a collection printed in the States by 2D Cloud titled Rudy. And of course, Mark Bell's Hot Potato, kind of an overview of his whole career, published by Drawn and Quarterly, gorgeous book. And if I can throw my name in there, because I figure I'm part of Psychedoolia, Koyama Press publishing Somnambulance, a collection of 30 years of my comics. So there are some resources that maybe they're not the actual objects, but there are a growing collection of Canadian, of this kind of ephemeral history happening in regards to Psychedoolia, at the very least. And can I give a shout out to Joel Ullman and Michelle Rabagliati getting nominations for the Governor General Awards, Literary Awards, and I believe it's they're the first adult graphic novels nominated.
You absolutely can give that shout out, and you already did. Thank you very much, and thank you for bringing in what I think is very important, and something that I think is, I'm very happy about with this symposium generally, is the extent to which the perspective of the people who are actually making the comics matters. It does tend to get overlooked in these discussions. We've had a lot of discussion, more or less circling around similar topics. So if you don't mind, given that we're coming up on the end, I'd like to ask a very different question that came in from Matthew Murray. It was addressed to Julie, but again, I think many the panelists may be able to speak to it. Have you tried to read and discuss comics that originally serialized a chapter at a time to try to recreate the original context to a small degree? That is, rather than in effect just reading the whole story as one, have you tried trying to replicate the experience of reading it or teaching it this way, equivalent to how it might have been originally experienced as a serial publication? And what differences do you think that might make to how we understand this material?
And my answer is, what a great idea that is. I'm going to do that next time. I have never done that, and I should, because time and reading is the most important thing to figure out, like how slow those stories came out sometimes. So thank you.
Thank Matthew.
Julie, Hope Nicholson did a reproduction, I think, of WoW comics, maybe, of the Polka Dot Pirate issue. I don't know if you've seen that. So that I think it's the complete issue as a, that she republished as a floppy. I actually have a box of about 100 of them in my office. So if I ever go back on campus, I'll gladly send you one.
Wow, I'd love that. Thanks a lot, Andrew.
Did any other panelists want to speak to that, either as something you have tried or as something you have thoughts about in terms of how it might be a useful pedagogical strategy?
Yeah, I've done it with Tintin, because there is an archive of some of the stories available online, and so I sometimes teach, especially the ones at the beginning, like Tintin in Congo, and of course with all the issues that it brings. So I did that several times, actually teaching one episode and then talk about the episode, and then trying to imagine the follow-up of the episode, for example, and asking the students to imagine it, and according to the context and the discussion we had around that. So yeah, I did a little bit.
Thank you. I see a question here that's specifically for Fiona, which I think also touches interestingly on topics that we've had come up a lot, both in the keynote this morning and today. Candida asks, Fiona, I want to know if you ever identify as a Canadian cartoonist, or if you have other affiliations that are more important to you.
Yes, definitely Canadian cartoonist. It's usually preceded by a feminist artist. But yeah, definitely, I always mention Toronto, or yeah, and I also want to add that the sex ed books that I work on with Corey Silverberg, Sex is a Funny Word, has been ever since it came out in 2015, it's been on the most contested books list for school libraries in the States. So I just want to add that. But yes, Canadian cartoonist.
Can I just ask a follow-up? Fiona, in that psychedelia scene, did you see yourselves as distinctly Canadian, or was it about something else? I'm trying to establish whether there is even a sense of Canadianness that maybe scholars are trying to impose on Canadian artists, or whether you had that sense of yourselves.
I think we had that sense of ourselves, and you can see it in the Weird Things crew who would hang out. And there's an animated film called Asphalt Watches by Seth Scriver and Shane Emmon, and it's so Canadian it hurts. It's just hilarious, and it's very, very Canadian, and it's a road trip, and it's this psychedelia weirdness. Check it out, Asphalt Watches, if you haven't heard of it before.
Thank you. There's maybe time for one more question, and I do have a question for further up in the chat that was for one panelist in particular, but if anyone else has a more general question that might apply to everyone, if you want to fire it.
I don't have a question, but I want to show off the WoW comics that was just mentioned. This
Okay.
is the one that Hope Nicholson did, and so it reprints the entire issue, #1, including like text pages and stuff. And like competitions and everything in it. It is, because it's #1, it doesn't have letters pages or anything like that. That might have been in further issues, but it is something that is really neat to look at if you're interested.
Yeah, I think all of us want a copy of that. Okay, then I will ask this one final question, although after 2 o'clock, if people want to hang around maybe for a few minutes to talk, they can, although we have a break schedule then. There was a question for Amie, and I actually do want to ask this because it's something that I was very much concerned about myself. You already touched on when these boards stopped existing and these bans stopped being enforced, but did they keep comics out of Alberta entirely? If so, when did they come back? And also, you mentioned the court case in 1987. Can you speak more to that? What were the comics that were at issue, and what was the outcome of that?
So I know for the 1987, I think, Leonard, you're on the line. So from the Canadian Legal Defense Fund, which is the Canadian arm of the Cartoonist Legal Defense Fund, they had actually come into being after the 1987 case. I think, and this is something that, I'm researching now, because what's really quite unusual is we have very little known about the Canadian organizations. And I can speak to, from the library profession, we know that gatekeeping is endemic in our profession, and it's very, very hard to study. So what I would also argue is that this had a professional impact in terms of scholarship. So taking, for example, Bruce Peel, I mean, he is the chief librarian for 30 years at the University of Alberta. He's the Canadian Library Association president. And for me, I'm also trying to recontextualize this in the time in history. And so Canadian Library Association is currently defunct, but for the time that it was active, there was a huge schism within the profession in the early 1970s. We have a group of especially feminist librarians in the profession saying, like, we're super conservative, especially the Canadian Library Association, and a push and pull between political activism and the way we present professionally. Bruce Peel, quite famously, was not a fan of the American Library Association and criticized the involvement of American librarians in, for example, protesting the Vietnam War in the early 1970s. He argued that libraries should, quote, be neutral. And yet we have someone who, for at least a decade, was actively involved in soft censorship of materials coming into the province. So I think it's hard to pinpoint the exact impact. For example, with Playboy being banned in 1962, I mean, people obviously had their hands on it. One of the things that the 1987 article in the Calgary Herald, which was written by legal scholar Janice Dickin McInnes, talks about is the idea of soft sort of suppressive powers, the threat of prosecution. And I think that's something that has been completely undiscussed in terms of Canadian comic history, is that for all of these vendors, all of these libraries, bookstore, you have the threat potentially of prosecution under the criminal code in Canada till 2018. And I think that's super hard to put in concrete terms. One of the things I was able to find in the board minutes is there's minutes from the late 1950s in which they are talking to a newsstand vendor in Alberta, and the assistant district attorney is there from Alberta at the meeting, and the assistant district attorney is saying, like, we have your back no matter what, to the advisory board. And I mean, the threat isn't explicit, not I will prosecute you, but I can imagine for the newsstand vendor there, I mean, it's a very clear sort of soft threat that was lingering for people for a very long time. And I think especially teasing out that legal distinction in Canada, that this existed for so long, I want to start poking at other obscenity cases in Canada and just seeing, because it's also so arbitrary in terms of the idea of community standards. So my argument is, I think it had a very residual impact that we're just starting to really piece apart in terms of professional practice for today.
Do you know particularly which comics, if there were specific comics that Comics Legends was gone after for?
So this is, I think, what's really interesting is, even with the idea of finding the idea of crime comics, is I think it creates an idea reflecting back in the historical record that certain comics were zeroed in on, but it looks like in terms of actual practice, it was such an umbrella term used very indiscriminately. I will say for the Alberta board, in their records, they have a list of some of the comics that they found objectionable, but what's really interesting with the Alberta board, they followed standards that other places used, including in Australia with censorship there. They actually kept their lists of objectionable materials private. They wouldn't publish it. And so it was, I think the threat is, it continues behind the scenes. This is in relationship to the US, you have places like the Cincinnati board who were publicizing their lists, also the National Organization for Decent Literature, they were publicizing their lists, but we have a lot of boards holding this back because I think it actually furthered this behind the scenes motivations, and it was so arbitrary. I mean, we have discussions of comics through the late 1950s, early 1960s, they tended to like to use the bombastic language. Like there was a lot of discussion about cannibalism and like lurid sexual depravity, but very little explicit connection to particular titles. And I think we see this even the late 1940s. I mean, of course, when Wortham and colleagues are making their rounds around 48, they're talking about Superman being, you know, a vigilante, and basically comparing Superman as like sort of like a Nazi. And yet we have Superman in the mid 1940s with the radio show like Superman versus the KKK. And so we have these very different depictions of particular titles existing both legally in terms of popular usage, I think, right from the beginning.
Thank you. We are a little bit past 2 o'clock, so I'll just ask if any of the panelists have any final comments or observations they wish to make before we formally conclude this session.
Just one more time to thank the committee for organizing this beautiful conference. I think it's something that I would like to say.
Yes, big thanks.
I agree. Thank you so much. Really, really interesting.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks to all you presenters as well today for your work and for attending the roundtable. As I said, I'm going to stop the recording now, but if anyone maybe wants to ask a question or two, maybe we can hang around for just a few minutes, but I suspect everyone would like a bit of a break as well before the next session.